Good afternoon to all of you, or good evening, or good morning from wherever in the world you may be joining us today on Zoom. My name is Jeroen Dewulf. I am the director of the UC Berkeley Institute of European Studies. I would like to welcome all of you to today's conversation on the Filangieri-Franklin Correspondence, a 240 years long discourse between Italy and the United States. This event is co-sponsored by the UC Berkeley Department of Italian Studies, by the Italian Cultural Institute in San Francisco, by the Consulate General of Italy in San Francisco, by the American Philosophical Society, also by the Federico II University of Naples, and the National Italian American Foundation. Obviously, very grateful for this support. It's also my honor to welcome a couple of representatives of our co-sponsors. We're still waiting for His Excellency Consul General Sergio Strozzi to arrive. I think we're also waiting for the director of the Italian Cultural Institute, Annamaria to arrive, but we have with us already on Zoom Patrick Spero, who's the director of the American Philosophical Society. And we also welcome on Zoom Antonio Giordano, the director of the National Italian American Foundation. But before I give the floor to our guests for a brief welcome, allow me to introduce today's speaker. We're honored to have with us here today Professor Amedeo Arena. Amedeo Arena is full professor at the Faculty of Law at the University of Naples, where he teaches European Union law and EU law in action. He also serves as faculty delegate for international cooperation and is the academic coordinator of the Erasmus Plus Cooperation Agreement with our institute, here our Institute of European Studies in Berkeley, in the context of which we had an exchange, a very fruitful exchange of faculty and scholars. Professor Arena is going to be in the Bay Area for 4 days and will give talks with a focus on Neapolitan, Italian, and European legal heritage and culture. Tomorrow, he will give a guest lecture at Santa Clara University on the contribution of Italian jurists to the process of European integration, from Nicolao Catalano to Giuseppe Pisauro. On Tuesday, he will give another talk here at UC Berkeley at the Department of Italian Studies on the language of lawyers through the eyes of Italian writers, from Alessandro Manzoni to Italo Calvino. And finally, on Friday, he will be welcomed here again at our Institute of European Studies to examine the making of the European Constitution and its unwritten supremacy clause. Today's talk will be very different. It will be a talk about the Neapolitan Enlightenment philosopher, Gaetano Filangieri, and his correspondence with the United States founding father, Benjamin Franklin. Yet before I give the floor to Professor Arena to tell us more about this fascinating Italian-American connection, I would like to ask perhaps first Patrick Spero, the director of the American Philosophical Society, to have a brief welcome and to say a few words before we start the event. So Patrick, the floor is yours.
I quickly want to just, first off, I'm thrilled to be here. I wish I could be there in person, and I wish I could hear the other 3 talks that are scheduled. My name is Patrick Spero. I'm the librarian of the American Philosophical Society, and we are a repository that holds some of the correspondence that I think the professor is going to speak about soon. Some of you may not be familiar with the American Philosophical Society, so I quickly wanted to say who we are and some of our own connections to Italy. So we were founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1743, so the subject of today's talk. We were founded as a scientific society modeled on the Royal Society in England and the French Academy of Sciences. The idea was to bring together the leading thinkers in colonial America in 1743 and share with each other what they were discovering in their home communities, but also equally as important, I think maybe just as important, was to share this knowledge with Europe, to have the American Philosophical Society be a connector to European intellectuals and scholars. And I think the talk tonight is part of the outgrowth of this initiative begun, 50 years earlier. So what the APS does today is we elect members. We have over 850 members in the United States and 150 international. We hold meetings twice a year to bring together members and others to share cutting edge research in all different fields. We have the longest continuously operating publications program in North America. I say that, no one's corrected me, so it must be true. We give out over $1.5 million of research grants for scholars in all different fields at all different stages of their career to study anywhere in the world. So we have supported research in Italy. And we also have a library and museum, which is what I oversee. We have over 14 million pages of manuscripts, 300,000 books. We have the papers of Benjamin Franklin. We have the journals of Lewis and Clark, but we continue to collect. And today we have the papers of 7 Nobel laureates. And we showcase these treasures to the world in a museum that welcomes over 190,000 visitors a year. And I think the reason that we've been invited today is that we have the papers of Benjamin Franklin. And in those papers are many of Franklin's connections to European intellectuals. And of course, among those are many Italians. And we're going to hear about his connections tonight, later in his career, talking about politics and constitutions. But his earliest connections dealt with his scientific work. The Philosophical Society published a book in the 1950s on Benjamin Franklin in Italy, which really explores this in depth. And I encourage anybody to check it out. It's available for free at the Hathi Trust. And pictured here is Cesare Beccaria, who Franklin corresponded with, dealing with his experiments in electricity earlier in his life in the 1750s and 60s. And we can see his Franklin's own evolution and his connections with Italy. So in this earlier period, he's writing about his scientific work. And later, we're going to hear about him and his connections dealing with politics and constitution making. But our connections aren't just there. Thomas Jefferson was the Society's president for 17 years. He was a close correspondent with Giovanni Fabroni. This is a letter that Jefferson sent to Fabroni in which he's talking about his desire to exchange plants and seeds so that they can share their knowledge of the natural world. He's writing this in the middle of the American Revolution, and he also provides a detailed account of what's happening in the war. And picture right next to it is, I love this picture. What you're looking at are actually the papers of Fabroni. The American Philosophical Society has the Fabroni papers, and that's what you're looking at directly. And just to the right of them are the Franklin papers. So it's a nice connection to tonight. And this connection continues today. We have 7 Italians who are elected to membership here. And you can see our list of current APS members who are based in Italy. So again, thank you for inviting us to be a part of this. We're happy to be a part and to continue this connection between Italy and the American Philosophical Society. So thank you, and I look forward to the talk.
Thank you so much, Patrick. It was wonderful. And I see that our Consul General is also arriving. So why don't I ask both the Consul and also Annamaria di Giorgio to join us here at the front to say a few words.
Professor Arena, we are so glad to have you here. We are delighted to be at the university here in Berkeley. And we are glad to the American Philosophical Society Academy for hosting us. My name is Sergio Strozzi. I'm the Consul General of Italy in San Francisco. And I look forward to hear from Professor Arena about this amazing correspondence between Franklin and Filangieri. What I can say as Italian representative of our country is that Italy has a long story of philosophists and jurists. At the same time, I keep remembering and reminding myself and our guests, for example, when we do the Italian National Day in June, that one of our most exportable philosophist is Cesare Beccaria. I'm very close to, very affectionate to. And I think he's very close to Filangieri, both in Illuminists and both philosophists and jurists as well. Let me say Professor Arena will be not very much with me on saying that, but to some extent, Cesare Beccaria went even further than Filangieri to some extent. For example, on the death penalty, he was against the death penalty, whereas Filangieri was sort of in favor, or still admitted. So, but just to say that Italy has a long tradition of jurists in favor of human rights, of pursuing the happiness of people, and that's what I think we are talking about, and that's the message Filangieri and Franklin was exchanging with each other, and saying that. After said that, I leave the floor to you. Thank you so much again.
Thank you. So wonderful, wonderful.
And the director of the Italian Cultural Institute, Annamaria di Giorgio, is with me. Yeah.
Buonasera a tutti. A very good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Annamaria di Giorgio. I'm the director of the Italian Cultural Institute in San Francisco. I'm honored to be here tonight to celebrate this crucial exchange between Italy and the US. And please allow me to thank, first of all, Professor Dewulf and Professor Arena and Professor Pirillo that couldn't be with us today, for involving us in this event and for having us tonight. And a special thank, of course, to our Consul General, Sergio Strozzi, for always supporting our cultural program. And the Filangieri-Franklin Correspondence symbolizes the starting point of a discourse between Italians and Americans on shared values, and it's amazing how significant these values still are today, especially today, I would say, in this such a grim international scene. And quoting an article by Professor Arena that I found very interesting, the first of those values is protection of human rights, as Filangieri put it, or the invaluable right of humanity and reason. And the second shared value is that of peace, central for both intellectuals. I quote Filangieri: "Break these cruel borders, abort these absurd distinctions between one nation and another. Fatal remnants of the ancient prejudices of barbarism, always destructive, but nowadays a disgrace for a century that deems itself enlightened and in fact should be so." And I find it impressive to read it nowadays. And the third shared value is that of public education, because Filangieri called for universal compulsory education, posing a great emphasis on the teaching of foreign languages, deemed an indispensable premise for promoting mutual understanding between peoples. And this is also part of our mission here in the United States, promoting Italian language and culture and bridging the Italian and American culture in the Bay Area with the same purpose, together with you and our prestigious partners. So let me conclude with a good news. The letters Franklin and Filangieri exchange, kept at the Filangieri Civic Museum in Naples and the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania, will be now reunited for a small temporary exhibition at the Italian Cultural Institute in San Francisco in our new spaces at Innovit, the first Italian innovation and culture hub in the world, conceived by the Italian Ministry for Foreign Affairs. We just moved. We are in Sansom Street 710. So I hope you can visit us and join us during the month of October. That's also the Italian Heritage Month. We have a rich calendar of events. So we hope this talk and the exhibition that will come will contribute to foster the exchange between our two countries once again. And now, with no further ado, I leave the floor to Professor Arena. Grazie. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Maybe if I may just also highlight that among our many co-sponsors, we're also honored to have the support for today's event of the National Italian American Foundation, and the director, Antonio Giordano, is on Zoom, if I'm not mistaken. So I would also like to ask Dr. Giordano to say a few words before we start.
Sure. My name is Antonio Giordano, and I am the president of Spero Health Research Organization, but I also represent as an officer and member of the board member of the National Italian American Foundation, that represent 20 million American Italians in United States. And so we are very supportive of this fantastic initiative of Professor Arena, that was able really to bring to light this major relation of this great Neapolitan. And I'll say this also because of my Neapolitan origin, so that I share with Amedeo Arena and also with the Filangieri. And the figure of Filangieri really is extremely popular and in the Neapolitan culture, but really was not evaluated a lot, the work that really Filangieri generated, also because unfortunately died also very young, but this link and this contribution, like another great Italian, Philip Mazzei, in influencing in or in giving his cultural contribution, okay, to the American Constitution. Of course, I have also a close link with Philadelphia, because my Cancer Institute is at Temple University. So therefore, even the and we heard before, even the this Renaissance mind of Franklin really struck my interest, also as a scientist, and also as a link that he had with other Italian great mind like Beccaria. So with the National Italian American Foundation, anyway, we are going to really support this initiative, and we are going, especially in the next year, that turned out to be really a major anniversary for Franklin, to promote also this Italian great philosopher and political scientist, like Filangieri. So thank you very much, and for to the Berkeley also University, and to the Italian community in California, that is very large. I know that with NIAF, we have the National American Foundation, we are building up really a stronger tie with California, with San Francisco, Los Angeles, and with several institutions in the area. So I'm going to follow this interesting event, and I'm looking forward also to more events that will bring to light the Filangieri work, and more people really could realize his role that he had in this very important historical segment of the American life. Thank you very much to everyone.
Thank you so much.
All right, so good afternoon, everybody. It's really an honor to be here. And these, of course, are not words dictated by the circumstances. It is an honor that the cooperation between Federico II University and UC Berkeley is ongoing. And I don't think it's a coincidence. UC Berkeley is considered America's first public university. Federico II is Europe's oldest public university. So there are a lot of common values here. And we also thank Consul General Strozzi and Director Giorgio from the Italian Cultural Institute here in San Francisco. One thing that we do at Federico II, we have a long-standing agreement with Denver University. So Denver students, Denver law students, they visit Naples, and when they do, we have field trips. We visit the Constitutional Court, we do that every year. This year, for the first time, we visited Quirinal, and it's something that really was, memorable. Not only for the American students, but also for me as an Italian citizen. So it's great that when culture is at issue, the Italian authorities are with us. That means a lot. And well, let me also thank Director Spero. Well, the American Philosophical Society was established by Benjamin Franklin. So I think that requires no further commentary on how important is the participation of the American Philosophical Society as a co-sponsor. And last but definitely not least, the National Italian American Foundation. So I think it is important for the Italian American community to have someone they look up to. And probably this could be Filangieri, champion of human rights, champion of peace, whose writings are extremely relevant nowadays. And also thanks to Antonio Giordano, who has been part on board with this project from the very beginning. So when Denver University students and scholars visited the Filangieri Museum in Naples to examine the letters that Franklin had sent to Filangieri, Antonio Giordano was there along as with the US Consul for Culture. So that also means a lot of it. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Antonio. All right, so what is the subject of today's talk? The Filangieri-Franklin Correspondence. Franklin, of course, needs no introduction here in the United States. Filangieri probably would need no introduction in Italy. I think he can be defined as the greatest representative of what we could call Neapolitan Enlightenment, late Italian Enlightenment. The French would call him the Italian Montesquieu. Napoleon would call him the teacher of us all, because of the influence of his writing on the revolution that had taken place just a few years after his death. So who was Filangieri? He was the third of 11 children of Cesare Filangieri d'Arianello, a very noble Italian family, long-standing noble tradition dating back to the 11th century. And yet, as many noble families in Naples, facing economic difficulties. He was intended for a military career, but it soon realized that that wasn't his job. And we will see that he was definitely against the military career, unlike his child, by the way, Carlo. His father got him a mentor, Luca Nicola De Luca, and with him he traveled to Palermo, also with his uncle Serafino Filangieri, where he witnessed a revolt by farmers against landowners, thus having a first-hand experience of what was wrong in the economic structure of the Kingdom of Two Sicilies, so developing some ideas there. In 1774, he went back to Naples to study law, and then on that occasion he was appalled by the magnitude, the discretion the Neapolitan judges at the time had in the administration of justice, in the interpretation of the law that often led to arbitrariness. And so when Minister Tanucci issued a law that required the judges to give reasons for their decision, he saluted that law as a welcome novelty. In the following years, he devoted his life to writing the first two volumes of his masterpiece, The Science of Legislation, a treatise on good government, seeking the happiness of humanity by laying down detailed suggestions on how to reform legislation. So today's talk is about correspondence. Correspondence, the dictionary definition is communication by exchange of letters. And I think we should remind that, especially considering that we're not too far from the Silicon Valley here. So at the time, communication took place with actual paper and ink. There was no instant messaging. Letters would take up to 6 months to reach their recipient. And also there was no confirmation of receipt. Of course, we are very used to it now, right? And so Filangieri, for example, had to write a second letter because he was not sure that the previous one had reached Franklin, and indeed some would get lost. So the Filangieri-Franklin correspondence consists, at least that we know of, 6 letters sent from Filangieri to Franklin, plus one written by Filangieri's widow, Charlotte Frendel, and 2 letters from Franklin to Filangieri, plus another, never sent, that is believed to be addressed to Filangieri, written in French by Franklin. Oh, and speaking of languages, there was no automatic translation either. But there was no need for that, because Franklin, who wrote in English, could read Italian, as well as Jefferson. He was self-taught. Filangieri instead wrote in Italian, but he could also read French and English, as well as Latin and Greek, of course. Unlike today's emails, these letters had attachments, and quite a relevant one, if I may say. So let's have a look at the attachments. These are the letters. And these are the attachments that Franklin sent. So he sent two very important attachments. First was a copy of the 13 constitutions of the United States of America, a French translation of that. And the other attachment he sent with his last letter to Filangieri in 1787 was the yet unratified US federal constitution. Unfortunately, Filangieri only received the latter when he was already sick with tuberculosis. But instead, there is a very interesting story concerning the first attachment, because that was a publication sponsored by Benjamin Franklin. He was an envoy of the American Congress in Europe. And so he had these 13 constitutions translated into French to be distributed to ambassadors and monarchs, as well as intellectuals, and so that was the case of Filangieri. Now, we have not recovered Filangieri's copy of the 13 constitutions yet, but we know from Filangieri's nephew, also named Gaetano Filangieri, the founder of the Museo Civico Filangieri in Naples, that Filangieri received these 13 constitutions, made some commentaries and sent them back to Franklin, and then Franklin sent it back to Filangieri. So that will look like a document with a lot of markups, probably. And although in 2011 the Italian embassy in DC looked for it, it was not recovered yet. But who knows? Maybe it will come out. What about Filangieri's attachment? Well, Filangieri attached his life work, his masterpiece, The Science of Legislation, his treatise on good government, seeking to reform legislation to achieve the happiness of humankind. It consists of 5 books and 8 volumes. The 5th book, or 8th volume, was published posthumous in 1791. So this work was unfinished. Just to get an idea of the sheer size of the work we're talking about, it consists of more than 450,000 words. That is 2 times Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, or to have a better idea of something more familiar, more or less the same size of the 6 books of Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, excluding The Hobbit. So Italian scholars such as Di Donato speculate that very few have read all of it. Filangieri, what was his creative process, so to speak? Because the other thing, as well, except for the size, is the quantity and quality of the sources he employed. So, for example, in Book 3 on criminal law and criminal procedure, he wrote to Franklin that he had to compare all laws of many different countries, from ancient Greece and after. And so we know from Giulio Bernardino Tomita that he would spend at least 11 hours per day studying these classic sources and copying them to a notebook. And then he would start drafting the science of legislation. And we know from his biographer, Donato Tommasi, that often the first draft was the definitive draft. So not a lot of editing there, because his mind was so spacious as that he could immediately figure out what to write and in what order. This book, this treatise, was an immediate bestseller of the time. It was translated into French, English, Spanish, Polish, German, Swedish, Danish, and Russian. It was initially approved enthusiastically by the ecclesiastical authorities, although in 1784 it was blacklisted because apparently it came out that Filangieri suggested, among other things, to reduce ecclesiastical immunities, the number of clergymen, and to secularize ecclesiastical properties. That didn't fly very well with a Catholic church. We can imagine. All right, how did the two get in touch? Social networks in the 18th century. no LinkedIn at the time, but they got in touch when Franklin was in Paris as a delegate to the American Congress to the court of Louis XVI, and heard of Filangieri's work from Luigi Pio, a Neapolitan diplomat, the de facto Neapolitan ambassador, because the ambassador wasn't there in Paris, who knew Franklin in a private capacity. What does it mean? That Franklin, Pio, and Filangieri were Freemasons. Franklin, as a matter of fact, was in 1781 the Grand Master of the Lodge of the Nine Sisters, a very powerful Masonic lodge, also including Voltaire, Thomas Jefferson. So that was a powerhouse, a platform for the American Revolution cause. And Freemasonry was also essential for promoting the ideals of the American Revolution and the myth of Philadelphia like the ideal city. The Masonic lodges brought together over 250,000 intellectuals from different countries and different conditions on the basis of equality. Their oath was, we're all brothers, instrument of the same providence, we are equals, only merit and abilities distinguish us. And they had their own constitutions. So that seems to be relevant. So what happened? Pio gave Filangieri the first two books of the science of legislation. He wrote to Filangieri that although Franklin didn't read Italian very well, he understood it perfectly and found Filangieri's thought expressed with great clarity and precision. I think there can be no greater compliment for any writer. Filangieri was delighted and sent Franklin he sent him two letters, as a matter of fact. We can understand the fascination of a younger intellectual being in so high regard by a world-known intellectual such as Franklin. Franklin was almost 50 years older than Filangieri, who was in his late 20s. And at the time, European intellectuals in general were fascinating with the American Revolution, and Franklin in particular, with his fur hat, his lightning rod, and he was considered as the main architect of the American Revolution and its finest jurists. There was this idea that ab oriente lux, light comes from the east and goes to the west, and I think it's particularly fitting to discuss this here in Berkeley. Fiat lux, right? And that's the motto of UC Berkeley. So Franklin replied in January 1783 that he was impressed by Filangieri's excellent work and was curious about the following volumes of the Science of Legislation, which will be devoted to criminal law and procedure, as in Franklin's opinion unknown, had more need for reformation. The correspondence continued even as Franklin returned to the United States. His last letter to Filangieri was of 14th of October 1787, attaching a copy of the just approved US Constitution and asking for 8 copies of the invaluable work of Filangieri. As I mentioned, Filangieri was already sick, and so the last letter closing the correspondence was written by Filangieri's widow, Charlotte Frendel, who sent Franklin the copies he had requested and promised to send the yet unpublished parts. So this begs the question, why is the Filangieri correspondence still relevant and still of interest? It has been studied by several scholars, Antonio Pace, Marcello Maestro, Eugenio Losardo, Vincenzo Ferrone, Monica D'Agostini. It has been the subject of countless conferences, including, and that was one that was very important for me because that's when I got interested in this correspondence, one held by the Italian embassy in DC. And there was Antonin Scalia as speaker, as well as Giannicola Sinisi. And then there was a follow-up 10-year anniversary webinar promoted by Italian Cultural Institute in New York. So kudos to the Italian Cultural Institute. And then there was this visit of Denver scholars and students at the Filangieri Museum, where the US Consul and Antonio Giordano from NIAF were also present. That is the ground floor of the Filangieri Museum, beautiful museum, by the way. And so this begs the question, why is this correspondence still of interest? And I think probably the answer lies in the second dictionary definition of the word correspondence. Correspondence is not only communication by exchange of letters, but also a close similarity of values and ideas, shared not only by Filangieri and Franklin, but many other Italians and Americans since then. So this Franklin-Filangieri correspondence arguably symbolizes the starting point of a discourse on certain shared values between Italians and Americans, which were discussed at length in the science of legislation and that are still relevant nowadays. So let's examine some of those values. The pursuit of public happiness. The happiness of humankind was the very purpose not only of Filangieri's work, but of Filangieri's life. This is why his tutor, Luca Nicola De Luca, called him Philander, to undermine his love for humanity. He already hinted at the importance of law, of the formation of law, of the reform of law for public happiness in La Morale Pubblica, published in 1775. The internal happiness of a nation, he wrote, cannot be by the outcome of good legislation. I will thus provide all the rules to enact legislation suitable for our times. And in introduction of the science of legislation, he wrote, all we need to do now is to promote the reform of legislation. It seems that this is the last step to achieve the happiness of mankind. And indeed, the word felicità, happiness, appears at least 120 times in the science of legislation. Of course, the pursuit of happiness also appears in another very important historic document, the Declaration of Independence of 1776. It is believed that it was an adaptation of John Locke's conception of property that was originally a broader term, but the meaning had become narrower. So this is why Jefferson used the word happiness instead. We know that it was in Jefferson's initial draft of the Declaration of Independence that this word was not edited by Reviewer 1 and Reviewer 2, John Adams and Benjamin Franklin, was not edited by the Committee of Five, which made 26 edits, and even survived the depredations, that's how Jefferson called them, of the Continental Congress. So nobody dared to touch the pursuit of happiness. Now, we're not here to discuss the origins of this word. It's an ongoing debate in America. But what is relevant here is Filangieri's understanding of happiness, because he was struck by the inclusion of the pursuit of happiness in the Declaration of Independence. And so it's fit to develop his own understanding of the notion. And I think Filangieri could not be more straightforward on this point. For him, the pursuit of happiness was not an individualistic matter. Public happiness, he wrote, is the sum of individual happinesses. When the wealth is concentrated in a few hands, when few are the rich and many are the poor, the happiness of the few will not be the happiness of the people, but rather its ruin. He became an advocate of what we would now call social rights. He advocated for a fair distribution of the wealth of the state, the redistribution of land property, the abolishment of capitation, this idea that the poor and the rich would pay the same tax, the abolishment of monopolies, of primogeniture. When every citizen of a state can, with the work of 7-8 hours a day, meet the needs of himself and his family, that state would be the happiest on earth, he wrote. And the same logic, of course, underlies Article 3 of the Italian Constitution, which provides not only that all citizens have equal social dignity and are equal before the law, but also that it is the duty of our republic to remove those obstacles of economic or social nature which would constrain the freedom and equality of citizens, thereby impeding the full development of the human person and the effective participation of all workers in the political, economic, and social organization of the country. So, what was the way to ensure public happiness and the protection of these rights, social rights, but also other rights, of course? Filangieri was quite clear on that, and he believed that there were inviolable rights of humanity and reason, perpetual rights of the liberty of humanity, that is a natural law perspective, and he believed that the best way to protect them was to set out a constitution, a small separate code of the truly fundamental laws, and he even urged the British, who were very proud of their constitutional traditions, to enact new legislation which reconciles in one code liberty, peace, and reason, which would prevail over custom and tradition. And this is indeed what happened with the Bill of Rights, gathering the original 10 amendments of the US Constitution, as well as with the Declaration of Rights preceding the Neapolitan Constitution of 1799, drafted by Mario Pagano, a friend and disciple of Filangieri. Let's look, however, at the corollaries of this idea of the Constitution. So Filangieri clearly articulated the idea of constitutional supremacy. Legislation, he wrote, neither ought to destroy nor can destroy the Constitution. Neither custom, nor precedent, nor concessions, nor charters can give kings, magistrates, or nobles a right that is contrary to the freedom of the people, the safety of the citizen, or the interest of the nation, the happiness of which must always be supreme law. And we know that Franklin put two parallel vertical lines in his own copy of the Science of Legislation that is kept at the American Philosophical Society, so he was quite struck by this particular passage. Now, the American Constitution sets a very clear supremacy clause in Article 6, paragraph 2, declaring that the Constitution and the laws of the United States and the treaties concluded by the United States shall be the supreme law of the land. And also Article 117, paragraph 1 of the Italian Constitution stipulates that the legislative powers shall be exercised in compliance with the Constitution. But in order for this constitutional supremacy not to remain a dead letter, there must be a mechanism to invalidate the laws that are contrary to the Constitution. Now, Filangieri always spoke in the Science of Legislation of a censor of the laws, but it was Filangieri's friend and disciple Mario Pagani to bring this concept of constitutional supremacy into fruition in his draft of the Neapolitan Constitution of 1799. He envisaged an institution called the Ephorate, or the body of ephors, which would act as a bulwark of the Constitution, whose task was that of keeping each power within its proper bounds, rescinding and annulling the acts adopted beyond the limits set by the Constitution. And this marks the originality, by the way, of the Neapolitan Constitution vis-à-vis the French Constitution and the constitutions of the other Jacobean republics that mainly relied on the separation of powers to prevent abuse and the protection of individual rights. A similar proposal of a jury constitutionnaire was put forward by Abbé Sayé in 1795, but was ultimately rejected. And yet, we all know that the Neapolitan Republic faced a harsh fate because it was dependent on the military support of France. The loyalist forces took back control of the city on 13th of June 1799. The Republic collapsed, and its founding fathers, including Pagano, were executed in Piazza Mercato. However, this idea of constitutional supremacy and constitutional review of legislation became reality on the other side of the Atlantic, in the United States, with the famous Marbury versus Madison ruling of 1803, asserting a principle supposed to be essential to all written constitutions, that is to say that a law repugnant to the Constitution is void. In Italy, well, we had to wait until 1948 for judicial review of constitutionality to be provided in our own constitution. But as a matter of fact, the Italian Constitutional Court only became operational in 1956. The other aspect of constitutional supremacy is its vertical dimension. So Filangieri, in the Science of Legislation, claimed that what was really essential for legislation was uniformity. And of course, the uniformity was undermined by legislation enacted by different legislators in different governments. So he criticized feudalism as a form of government that tears up the state in several small states. Now, in the United States, the same concept had been expressed by two famous founding fathers. One was Alexander Hamilton, who in Federalist Number 33 wrote, "If individuals enter into separate society, the law of that society must be the supreme regulator of their conduct. If the number of political societies enter into larger political society, the laws of the latter, which the latter may enact pursuant to the powers entrusted by the Constitution, must necessarily be supreme over those societies and the individuals of whom they are comprised." James Madison, the father of the Constitution, in Federalist Number 44, argued that without supremacy, we would give rise to a monster in which the head was under the direction of the members. Now, in Italy, the original version of Article 117, paragraph 1, provided that regions could legislate only in a framework set out by national legislation. The current version instead devises a catalog of competencies and in concurrent competence, the regions may again only legislate in line with the fundamental principles set out by state legislation. What is interesting, however, is the contribution of Italians to the affirmation of the principle of supremacy at the EU level, that is to say, the supremacy of EU law over national law. And that essentially happened thanks to the contribution of 3 Italians, which, by the way, will be the subject of Friday's talk. One was Nicola Catalano, who, when drafting the institutional provisions of the Treaty of Rome, the one that established the European Economic Community, the predecessor of the European Union, managed to insert a provision, Article 177, granting the European Court of Justice the power to interpret community law. The other important figure was Alberto Trabucchi, who was a judge at the European Court of Justice, who was instrumental in swaying the vote of the majority in favor of what we would call direct effect. So the idea that community law creates rights and obligations the individuals can enforce can invoke before national courts in their own legal systems. And what if these rules were in conflict with national laws? Well, that was what the court clarified in Costainel, which was a case that was carefully constructed by Gian Galeazzo Stendardi, a Milanese scholar, an expert of constitutional law, and led to a judgment of the European Court of Justice that the EEC treaty is to be applied regardless of any domestic law, which, if we think about it, is very similar to the US Supreme Court ruling in Marbury versus Madison. Very similar to the Supremacy Clause, stating that anything in the Constitution or laws of any state, or to the contrary, notwithstanding. And Declaration 17, attached to the Treaty of Lisbon, stipulates that the treaties and the law adopted by the Union on the basis of the treaties have primacy over the law of the member states, and expressly recalls Costainel for that principle. And I think we have time just to examine one more commonality, and that is the freedom of commerce. Both were, as we saw from the previous slide, committed to the pursuit of peace, Filangieri and Franklin. And Filangieri in particular thought that in order to ensure peace, we had to take care of the roots of rivalries between countries. In particular, he believed that the main cause of war was the jealousy of trade among nations. And instead, he claimed that the world was interdependent, so countries should cooperate because, as a matter of fact, by liberalizing trade, there will be less conflict and more wealth for all the countries concerned. In the United States, something similar happened. So after the American Revolutions, the 13 colonies started favoring internal trade, leading to trade wars. And this, the solution to that was the creation of the Commerce Clause, thus granting the Congress exclusive jurisdiction over interstate trade, and even ruling out under the so-called Dormant Commerce Clause state laws that hinder cross-border trade. And of course, something like that happened also in Italy and the European Union, because indeed it was the very idea of the European Coal and Steel Community was to place Franco-German production of coal and steel under a common high authority, as that would make war between France and Germany not merely unthinkable, but materially impossible. This was brought to fruition by the Treaty of Paris, but the role of Italians here was also important, and especially of Gaetano Martino, in organizing the Messina Conference, which led to the generalization of this idea and the creation of the general common market. So economic integration not only in the field of coal and steel, but also of goods and services, and people, of course, and this led to the creation of the European Economic Community, the predecessor of the EU. So, to conclude, but there will be many other values to discuss. What is the road ahead? Well, as it was reminded at the beginning of this talk, the letters of the Filangieri-Franklin Correspondence are kept in at least 3 separate places. Some of kept are the Filangieri Civic Museum in Naples, other at the American Philosophical Society Philadelphia, and yet another at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. So these letters are kept more than 4,000 miles apart. What better occasion than the upcoming 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence to reunite for a temporary exhibition the actual letters of two thinkers whose values have been shared by Italians and Americans for more than 2 centuries? This is because the values enshrined by the Declaration of Independence have a global relevance. As Franklin pointed out in 1777, it is a common observation here in Europe, he wrote, that our cause is the cause of all mankind and that we're fighting for their liberty in defending our own. And Filangieri couldn't agree more. He considered philosophers, such as himself, citizens of all places, contemporary of all ages. The universe is his motherland, the earth is his school, his contemporaries and his posterity are his disciples. Therefore, I think that it is an extremely important step in this direction that the Italian Cultural Institute in San Francisco will soon have an exhibit featuring the copies of the letter on Franklin and Filangieri. Thank you very much.